There we go. Looks good.
Yeah. An official congratulations, by the way.
Oh, thank you. And to you.
Exciting. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
What did you set us up? Really? Oh, they can see you do this. There was always talk for years. CU love these around the Christian events. So then we actually thought we'd play with them and we played Gorilla Song. And as our publicity, we had this group of 8 of gorillas that would go round. What's your name? Climbing on tables. We were Matthew. Shopping trolley.
Oh, I haven't seen you before.
It's when the university works.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see, yeah. There'll be gorillas in badge as well.
We've taken it too
It says staff on it. That makes sense.
Yeah, it was so good. And then we ended up.
Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, this event's been pretty good. I mean, losing numbers of non-Christians mainly for like evenings that because that's where the free dinner is.
There we go. That's one of my favorite. I've got more.
Maths and physics. What sort of thing do you do? Is that, how does that work?
We do lots of it's mainly like research for external companies.
Nice to meet you. I'm Rebecca.
With both second years.
Apologies. I was getting postgrad.
Let's go to this one for an answer. I wonder what he's going to study.
Okay.
Hello guys, welcome to Good News. It's great to have you here. Yeah, I think we'll just get going with this event. My name is Adam. I'm a 4th year. I study Morse, and today I'm hosting with this person.
I'm Abby. I'm a 1st year and I study PACE. So today we're doing Q&A, but a few things first. One is there'll be pictures being taken, so if you don't want that, then at the back table behind you guys, over there, there's orange lanyards if you don't want your photo.
Yeah, and just a little bit more admin. If there's a fire, please leave. Go out the fire exits. They're all marked by the green signs. So there's 2 over there, there's 3 at the back. Some as well. Yeah, 2 behind me. And then the refuge points are sort of like the piazza and stuff like that. But if you've made it out of the fire, that's kind of what matters. Cool. Abby, what are we doing here today?
Well, we're doing a super fun Q&A. So as you guys can see, there's QR code there. So if you scan it, it'll take you to the Slido, which you can just ask an anonymous question. And me and Adam will see the questions on the phone and we'll ask for him. And
you all want to sort of get out your phones now, scan the QR code. Yeah, the way this is going to work is we're just doing question and answer about any questions you want to ask the panel, sort of to do with Christianity. Although the panelists will introduce themselves, so you might have a bit of an idea about what you might want to ask them after we've done that. Start getting those questions in as soon as you can. We might not be able to ask every question, but if you vote questions on the Slido, if you press the thumbs up, it will go to the top, and myself and Abby will be more likely to vote it. Just because it's at the top doesn't mean we will ask it. We can't promise to answer every question. I think we can now introduce our panelists over here.
With the fun fact.
So we'll start off with this over here. So who are you? What do you do?
Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm a PhD student here at Warwick in biomedical science. And I'm also part of the Christian postgraduate staff group that we have here at Warwick. And my fun fact is that, so I did my undergrad here at Warwick as well, and despite having never done it before, one of the societies I tried out here when I was at uni and ended up staying for almost 3 years was Irish dance. And don't ask me to do anything.
That's cool. Hi guys, so I'm Josh, and you could say, I'll do the fun fact first. So you could say my job is basically to go to Wetherspoons every week, and sometimes multiple times a week. But really my job is to work for a church and to share with people and let them ask their questions about Christianity, which is what we're doing here today. So I do a lot of that in Wetherspoons, but I do it in other places as well.
Is that your fun fact?
Yeah, we'll go.
Okay. My name's Tom. I'm a PhD student at the University of Aberdeen, just hoping to hand something in this summer. And I also have been involved in speaking about Christian faith and Christian questions after myself going to uni to do computer science and coming to a Christian faith while I was doing that computer science degree at Reading. That was a couple of years ago. And my fun fact is, I've been involved in a couple of police chases. Both as the chaser in a police car with a policeman catching someone, but also as the chased. It was a total case of mistaken identity, but there were 4 police cars and a helicopter involved in that chase.
Hi there, I'm Max. I'm a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, which is part of Oxford University. And in my job, I give lectures, I supervise PhD students, and I write books and articles that about 5 other academics read. Mostly I focus on philosophy of religion and epistemology in my research, so questions around the nature of evidence, rationality, particularly interested in thinking about questions to do with religious belief, religious disagreement, whether it's possible to have rational religious beliefs. But I'm also interested in questions about the historical Jesus. Very happy to take any of those sorts of questions. My fun fact is, I once worked in a chocolate factory, and it's not nearly as exciting as it sounds, sadly.
Okay, great. Well, then I think we can start with our first question. I'll just go from the first person that came in, which is what if I don't feel shame for my sins?
Sometimes I feel bad for what I do, and sometimes I don't. But that's not necessarily the truth of my feelings about whether I feel bad about it. It's not necessarily the truth of the situation. Christian faith isn't based on whether or not I feel shame, whether or not I experience that emotion, or that sort of self-reflective sort of attitude. Christian faith is based on Jesus Christ coming as God and saying, here is reality in what I say and what I do. there's a problem with human beings. The problem is human beings are alienated and separated from God because of our nature, because of our selfishness, because of sin, which is what the Bible's word is for not being as holy as God. And Jesus then dies on the cross to deal with that. Now, all of that's true. And Jesus is true in explaining that and in addressing that and inviting people to the possibility of a relationship with God, a new, restored, forgiven relationship. All of that's true whether we go through the experience of self-reflective shame or not. And so it doesn't stand or fall on whether or not you experience shame, but it might be that opening the door to Jesus and saying, look, I know I ought to feel bad about some of the stuff I've done and said in my past. I know I do have regrets. But maybe by opening the door and saying, will you forgive me? Will you show me more of what I'm like? Maybe that's the way to healthily acknowledge responsibility, but also receive forgiveness at the same time. So it's not based on whether or not we feel shame. It's based on Jesus, how he reveals God and the truth of what he says and does. But he, within that, invites us back to a way of addressing shame in a healthy way that isn't like being condemned, but is being freed to be who we are, to really acknowledge who we really are, and to be free in that, but forgiven in that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, just a reminder, just keep sending your questions in. We've got some real I'll go for experts on a lot of these topics. So ask all the difficult questions and controversial questions you like. I'm sure they'll be loving to answer. We'll go for the top question again. What if I want to be Christian, but I'm just not convinced?
Just keep looking. I hope, if you want to be a Christian, there's an understanding there that at least you can see the goodness of it. You can see why Christians think this is good news. This is good news for you. This is good news for the world. And so if you want to believe but you're not quite convinced, this is a truth that's worth kind of wrestling over. It's something that is worth keep going with it. I'd encourage you, the best way to do that, keep asking your questions and keep looking at some of particularly the Gospels, which is some of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life. You've got this Uncover Luke on the tables. Look at this is God's revelation of himself. So this is all the evidence that I believe, and a lot of people in this room will say, is convincing enough for them to believe. So keep looking into it. Keep asking your questions. If you have a Christian friend or you know someone who's a Christian, ask them to try and explain some of it to you, maybe to read some of the Bible with you. If you don't know, get in touch with the CU, and I'm sure they would love to pair you up with someone.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next one is, how do you answer someone who says there may be an infinite number of universes and we're just lucky to be living in one that supports our life?
I'll have a crack at this. So yeah, this is a kind of response to the argument from fine-tuning. I think in effect, so we've got a number of options on. So let me just back up a bit and say what the argument from fine-tuning is, because it is quite possible not everyone in the audience has come across this before. But so the idea is, in the last few decades in physics, there have been some discoveries that have indicated that various aspects of the fundamental structure of the physical universe, such as the strength of the force of gravity, the rate at which the universe expanded after the Big Bang, and so on, had to be within a very, very narrow range out of all the possible values they could have had in order to have a universe which would support life, right? And so then the thought is, and that the physics there is, as far as I understand it, is not just something that Christians would hold to. So Lord Martin Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal at Cambridge University, thinks that it is the case the universe has these features. It's sort of balanced on a knife edge. So I think you've kind of got a few options in terms of how to try and explain that. One is to say we're just very, 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 very lucky. That option doesn't really commend itself to many people who study this, because in general, when we're trying to explain a phenomenon and you've got a hypothesis that says it's an enormous coincidence and another hypothesis that says actually we've got some mechanism that means it's not a massive coincidence, you should go with the latter. Right, so that kind of leaves a couple of other options. So one is design. That in other words, there's an agent behind the universe who wanted it to have these features. And the other is I think the one you're hinting at, that there's a multiverse. There's actually not just this universe. There are loads like it, except that they vary in subtle ways in terms of like how strong the force of gravity is. And I suppose the thought is like, if you have enough of these, then you're bound to get at least one that can host life. So I suppose there's a few things I would say in response to that. One is that the multiverse hypothesis itself looks like it's going to need some fine-tuning, because in order for the multiverse to, in particular, generate universes like this one, it's already got to be constrained in certain ways. And so that brings in what's known as the higher order fine-tuning problem. In other words, it kind of kicks the can down the road. Another thing is that, the kinds of multiverse that are actually considered by physicists, some of them don't really postulate enough possibility of variation to be able to account for that we get, you don't have enough universes to make it probable that you would get one that's, got these specific features. So yeah, those would just be a few thoughts on why I don't think the appeal to a multiverse works.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much for that answer. We'll go for a question that's been on there for quite a while. Why is the church so often a place which excludes people on the grounds of sexuality or gender, or pretty much anything else?
Okay, so it's very interesting the extent to which Jesus is countercultural as he's presented in the gospel narrative. By the gospels we mean the eyewitness and second-hand witness accounts of Jesus' life. So the religious leaders at the time wouldn't have been big fans of tax collectors. They were people that took money for the government but then took extra sums for themselves. They wouldn't have been big fans of prostitutes. They wouldn't have been big fans of lepers, people that had the disease of leprosy. And yet these are all the groups of people that Jesus not only spoke to, but even had dinner with, which particularly in that culture was a sign of intimate friendship. And so it is true that Jesus is counterculturally and surprisingly going out of his way to welcome those that are rejected by society. And then you could ask the question, is he therefore endorsing their lifestyle? And we know that the answer is no, because Jesus doesn't endorse the lifestyle of the prostitute. He makes it clear elsewhere that the sexual relationship is to be enjoyed within the confines of marriage, which I think is also where the question's coming from. And so the behavior of Christians today should be the same. That's why we have this acronym, what would Jesus do? We should love all people, and particularly those that for whatever reason might feel rejection or being outcast from society in some sense. And so Christians shouldn't exclude certain people from the church, and where churches have done that, they've been wrong to do that, and they haven't been following in the example of Christ. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Christians endorse the behavior of everyone, but it does mean that they love them.
I think I'd just add as well that there has been, in the history of the church, there has been if not a nervousness, a mistreatment and a fear of people who are different. And the church has at times entered into abusive behavior, for example, in the American South. I think that it's very important that the church can acknowledge and say, we haven't treated people and reflected God's loving embrace and his outreach to people. But at the same time as that, to affirm what Josh says, saying actually it's not just that God says, I love you and you can just carry on doing whatever you want and be whoever you want. But God says, actually, I have a plan for you that's life-giving, that's real, that's hopeful, that will, where you can be loved, where you can be known as an individual, where you can be happy. Ben Thomas came yesterday to speak at the lunchtime talk, and Ben's story is that he was in a relationship with another guy, they were living together, and he, as he explored Christian faith, felt that the Lord was calling him, that God was both meeting him and revealing himself to him, but that God was calling him to walk a different way than how he was walking culturally. And so I think for each individual there is a journey sometimes of a story there to work out with God individually, but I would encourage you to look at Ben's example, but also to bear in mind that the church has got things wrong where we haven't reflected Christ and God, and that the answer to that is not just accepting everything. It's actually to make sure that we represent Christ's love and his acceptance better. So I'd want to acknowledge that the church has got things to own here and things to say sorry for.
Thanks, guys. That was really interesting. There's two here that I think are kind of similar. First one being, isn't the hope we get from believing in God just a form of terror management? And then slightly similar, Christians say we should fear God. What does this mean?
Well, it says in Isaiah at one point that we tremble at his word, which is interesting because I think if you came into the presence of King Charles, for example, I think you'd probably tremble, you'd be shaking a little bit, because you'd be thinking, this is such a big occasion, I'm coming before someone who's so important. And it's not necessarily the case that you're trembling out of fear of punishment in that circumstance, but you're just trembling at the magnitude of the occasion. Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't punish people, because he does, but at least for the Christian, those who believe in him, I think the idea of trembling at his word is a recognition of his majesty and his glory and who he is. The idea that there is something higher than us, far greater than us, and that something is actually a someone that we have to answer to. And I think we should all think about that with sober judgment. What could that mean for me and the way that I'm living? Is that going to have consequences? And what side of this God do I want to find myself on?
I'll just say, in terms of the terror management thing, really briefly, I think, in a sense, any accusation that Christianity is a sort of, it's a psychological crutch or it's wish fulfillment, in a sense, I think is slightly beside the point, in that if there is good reason to think that Christianity is true, then whether or not it's comforting is sort of beside the point in that sense, right? Whereas if there's no good reason to think Christianity is true, right, so I guess what I'm saying is, like, whatever psychological factors may or may not make Christianity appealing is sort of somewhat beside the point, when I would say the real question is there good enough evidence to think that Christianity is true, and that's the question I would focus on.
Thanks, guys. I think we'll go for one last question before we have a little break. The question we'll go for is, how would you refute the fifth row's dilemma? Does God do things because they are good, or are they good because God does them?
I was sitting in an undergraduate philosophy lecture, and this is what was thrown at me when I put my hand up and said, is there any merit in looking at the idea that goodness and values might come from God. And the professor said, you need to know about the Euthyphro dilemma, Tom. It's a problem, and I'm not sure that you can hold the view you're holding because of the Euthyphro dilemma. And here's the problem. It's that, is goodness something that God recognizes? In other words, it was before him, it was already existing, and therefore he recognizes it, and then sort of, commands in line with it, and therefore there's something better than God, that goodness is essentially God, and God's sort of some lower level operator. Or on the other hand, is goodness something that God just arbitrarily decides? He just chooses. And he could choose theoretically anything else to make good or to make bad. And therefore that seems to create a problem for the actual meaningfulness of goodness and evil. Now, the way to answer this is actually quite simple. It's called the essentialist response. And it's to say that God himself is the primary necessary being. He's the original being. He isn't dethroned by goodness. There isn't goodness before God, but goodness flows out of God's nature, and he commands and directs and speaks in line with his nature, so that goodness isn't arbitrary, but it's him commanding in line with his outworking nature. Now, this is known as kind of divine command theory academically. But I would like to spin that a bit and say, when God commands and when God speaks, there are these stories through the Bible. If you've ever read the Bible, there are these extraordinary stories in there, moments where human beings are just basically kind of getting into more and more of a mess over and over again. And then God speaks into those situations. And God, when he sends the prophet Nathan to speak to David, to bring truth into that situation, you're the one who's done this. Or when God speaks through the prophets, through the Old Testament, to say, rescue's coming, I'm your God, and you're my people, and I'm going to rescue you. Or when, through the New Testament, God speaks in the person of Jesus, or through the stories and the words of Jesus. What actually happens when God speaks is they're not just commands, they're life. They're life-giving. They bring, this truth brings light and truth and possibility in. So I'd like to say that when God speaks, he speaks in line with his nature, but it's not divine command theory, it's divine life theory, where God speaks and reveals himself in Jesus and brings life. So that's how I'd answer that one.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think that's really good. We're going to go for a short break now. So just discuss in your tables about what you've heard so far. What do you think of the answers? And maybe come up with some more questions you guys could ask. We'll come back in maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So yeah, go discuss.
stuff are we like to debate and discuss? And then there's like interrupted. Steve, these are cultural values and moral values that a lot of what we've had for eternity is that. And it's like, well, why do we have them? Like, there's something more there. How do you explain it? On my mind, quite physically as well. The questions actually been quite close. There's not been like, they've not been silly. Yeah, my flatmate. Yes. But maybe it's a human, you're not going to turn into a worm. So I feel there's going to be someone out there who's trying to come to work.
Surprise me.
Okay, guys, hope you had a nice discussion time with your table leaders, but we'll move on to another question, which is, why would you say Christianity is better than other religions which also have morals?
So I think we need to kind of reassess in some ways what is Christianity? Is it just a set of morals? Is it just a moral system similar to maybe other religions around the world? And I just challenge that slightly, well, quite a lot, to say what is different about Christianity compared to a lot of other religions is saying, well, a lot of religions would say, what do I need to do to get to God? In some religions, that is, what do I need to know or think? What do I need to feel? What do I need to do to earn my way? Christianity says the opposite. God has seen that we can't help ourselves and has made that step and has come to us to say, look, you are in this situation, but I have chosen to come down to earth, to go from being, in heaven to earth, to live the perfect life that we couldn't, and then to die, to take the punishment that we deserve, to raise to life, to prove all that he said was true. And it's all offered by what Christians like to call grace. It's not something that, it's a gift that we don't deserve, that we don't earn, that all Jesus says is is come to me. Come to me, and this is here for you. And I think that is fundamentally different from all the other religions in the world, is God stepping down to us to be known so that we can know him, not something that we have to earn or do or try to do to get to God, which we don't know whether we'll make it or not. But God says, no, it is done because I've done it for you. Just come to me, repent and believe.
Great answer. The next question we'll go for is, why does Jesus only claim to God in John's Gospel?
Yeah, I say something about this. Others might want to chip in as well. So I think the really important thing to say here is that, and this is a view I think that you would find represented among leading New Testament scholars, which is that John's Gospel makes very explicit what is already implicit in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John is not innovating in representing Jesus as seeing himself in God's place. So here's an analogy that might be a little bit of a helpful way in. So if someone is going around the town saying things about themselves, is this working all right? Yeah, such as I have the authority to dissolve Parliament. I'm the head of the Church of England. I have the power to bestow knighthoods. Who are they saying they are? So they're claiming to be the monarch of England, and they haven't said, I am the king of England, but they're claiming prerogatives that belong only to the monarch of England. And I would say that there very much are many examples of Jesus doing that in the Synoptic Gospels. So let me just give you a few highlighted themes here. So one way in which Jesus claims divine prerogatives in the Synoptic Gospels is that he regularly says that he is going to be the judge on Judgment Day. And he particularly does this through identifying himself with this figure, the Son of Man, which is a way of identifying himself with some texts in the Old Testament that depict a figure who shares the throne of God and who is there on Judgment Day, and all nations that worship and serve him. So Jesus appears to be claiming that particular divine prerogative. He claims to be able to forgive people outside of the temple sacrificial system. So yes, it's true, Jewish rabbis could proclaim forgiveness of sins, but only in reference to the sacrificial system of the Jerusalem temple. The thing that's scandalous about what Jesus does, and there's an episode in Mark chapter 2 where Jesus forgives someone's sins, and it causes offense to some of the onlooking religious leaders precisely because he appears to be claiming to do it unilaterally, which only God has the authority to do. He claims the authority to reinterpret the Torah, the law given to Moses. So he says things like, you have heard it said, it was permissible under certain circumstances for a man to divorce his wife and send her away, but that was a concession to your hardness of hearts, and I say to you. And he does that lots. And actually there was one of the top Jewish interpreters of what's known as the Mishnah. It's a collection of Jewish rabbinic writings, a scholar called Jacob Neusner. Not a Christian, but this is really interesting. When he read Jesus' teachings, studied them very carefully, the Sermon on the Mount, things like that, he said, I would like to ask Jesus, if I had the chance, who do you think you are? In other words, he's claiming such an authority with the way he handles the Torah that would be completely unthinkable for someone who merely sees themselves as a human teacher. I could give some other examples, but I think that's probably enough to illustrate that I think that Jesus is laying claim to divine prerogatives all over the place in the Synoptic Gospels, not just John.
Very quickly, on the table in front of you, there's an orange book, which is a copy of Luke's eyewitness account of Jesus' life. It's a free gift to you today. This is our free gift to you. If you're exploring, if you're a guest here today, not wearing a hoodie perhaps, you're so welcome to take one of these away with you for free. If you turn to page 42 and 43, you'll see an example of a story, an eyewitness recorded story where Jesus says to somebody, "Friend, sins are forgiven." The Pharisees and teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" It was entirely clear in the situation what Jesus was doing, and as Max has pointed out, exactly what that meant. There's your own example. You can take that away with you and have that and explore further.
Yeah, maybe just to add another gospel in there. How does the Gospel of Mark begin? Well, it begins in this way. The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, that's an Old Testament book written 700 years before Jesus. "I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord." And then if you go back to Isaiah, when it says prepare the way for the Lord, the word Lord, you'll see in most Bibles, is capitalized, which means it's the covenant name for God, Yahweh. And so when it says prepare the way for the Lord, it's referring to prepare the way for Yahweh, for God himself. And yet, in the very first verses of Mark's Gospel, he's applying that to John the Baptist, preparing the way for Jesus to come. And so at the very beginning of Mark, you've got a very clear claim that Jesus is actually Yahweh, who is God himself. Feel free to add to this, but I would say the Bible treats animal death as a bad thing. And that's important to mention because that's not true of all worldviews. But the Bible does make that clear in a number of places. For example, in the Old Testament book of Jonah, he's a prophet who was being disobedient to God. He was supposed to give a message to a city called Nineveh that they were going to be judged in 40 days, and the city ends up repenting, and God has mercy on them, and then Jonah is really annoyed about it. And God says to Jonah, well, if you're not at least pleased that all of the people have survived, what about all of the cattle that are in the city as well that have also been spared? And so the Bible does distinguish that human beings are made particularly in the image of God, but nevertheless, animal death is a negative thing. Another way you could see that is the Bible says there is no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood. And ultimately, that points to the fact that Jesus had to die on the cross for our sins. But in the Old Testament, which is everything before Jesus, you've got the Jewish sacrificial system where animals are sacrificed for the sin of the people. Now, we understand that these animal sacrifices were not able to pay the ultimate price that sin requires, which is why Jesus had to die. But nevertheless, the point of the animal sacrifices is that it is a sacrifice. It is a negative thing when animals die. And so it's never presented as a positive thing. And then the question of why is there animal death? Why is there anything negative in creation? It goes back to the fact that God made the world to be good. And he's going to restore the world to be good one day. But the reason why at the moment it's in bondage to decay is because human beings rebelled against God. And that didn't only have consequences for humans, it had consequences for the whole of creation, for animals, but also for the entirety of creation. The Bible says the creation is groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, waiting for its liberation from its bondage to decay. And that is what we look forward to when Jesus returns. He will make all things new. In the new heaven, there will be no animal death. There will be no human death.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
I could kick off. Okay, so in terms of the Old Testament, it's really what books from the Old Testament, or that Christians call the Old Testament, end up in the Bible is a matter of which books really by the time of Jesus were regarded as being in the Jewish canon. And we get a fair idea of that actually from which books Jesus himself refers to in the Old Testament. So the Law and the Prophets, it's the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and the prophetic books. So yeah, I mean that one is reasonably easy to kind of see how that came to be. So in terms of the New Testament, so the 4 Gospels, so there is a common misunderstanding, and I suppose, you know, Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, a couple of decades ago, promoted this idea, which I think floats around in popular culture, that, you know, there was this long list of books about Jesus in the first few centuries floating around, and all of them had a roughly equal claim to being reliable accounts, and then some ecclesial authority, or maybe the Emperor Constantine said, I want these ones for political reasons. But that is not kind of an account that you would find sort of endorsed by the mainstream of New Testament scholarship. So it's true that some books in the New Testament were more debated till even the 3rd century as to whether they should be included. So the book of Revelation, the second letter of Peter. However, in terms of the Gospels and Paul's letters, they were really, as far back as we can trace into the early 2nd century, there was a wide understanding among Christians across the Roman Empire that these were the authoritative eyewitness biographies of Jesus that were based in the testimony of the apostles, those who'd been with Jesus. And so let me just flesh this out briefly a little bit. So you've kind of, one thing that is significant is that we have statements from Christian authors in different corners of the Roman Empire by the middle of the 2nd century, all saying things to the effect of that there are 4 Gospels, and everyone knows this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so when you have someone in Syria, and someone in Rome, and someone in Gaul, different parts of the Roman Empire, all saying this, it strongly suggests that this reflects a common understanding that goes back considerably further. The other thing I would say is that actually, the other Gospels, so-called, didn't even begin to be written until the 2nd century. So in that sense, that there's just, even if we disregarded what Christians in the 2nd century thought, modern historians can look back now and say, look, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written in the 1st century. They are full of geographical, socio-political reference points that do marry up with what we know from archaeology and extra-biblical sources. They do seem to come from communities who had close connections with eyewitnesses, if not being written by eyewitnesses directly. The Gospel of Thomas clearly comes from a later period when a faction of Christianity that wants to try and sort of merge Christianity with Platonic philosophy, known as Gnosticism, is trying to use Jesus as effectively a talking head to promote that philosophy. And it really bears no resemblance to 1st century Palestine and the environment Jesus actually would have been in. And so that even just on those sort of modern grounds that a historian would take into consideration, there's every reason to treat Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as serious sources for the life of Jesus, whereas these other Gospels, which are written much later and clearly just don't have any of the hallmarks of being well connected to the time and place in which Jesus lived. So I hope that's helpful to start with.
Could you just read that one more time?
Yeah. What would you say to someone who needs scientific evidence to believe in God, or is there any?
I think we need to come back to what is the purpose of science, actually. What is science and what do we use it for? Because ultimately, science is a method. It's a hypothesis testing method. You have an idea, you do your experiments, you see what the conclusion leads to. Do we Does this really help us in so many areas? Absolutely. I wouldn't be in science if it didn't. It's so valuable. However, do we use science to answer every question? No. Because ultimately, it doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't talk to us about who we should love, who we should be friends with, what we should do, where do we find our purpose, maybe more widely. There are so many things that we don't rely on science for. Does that mean that there isn't good evidence for the Christian faith? Well, no, absolutely not. In fact, one of my favourite verses, we were talking about the Gospels, talking about John's Gospel, right at the end, John says, there's so many, I'm paraphrasing this, there's so many things I could have put in this book, but this was written, so what he's recorded, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God. He's telling you, go, look at the evidence, look into it, because it is there to be found. So it's not at all to say that Christianity is our evidence, or that we need science to answer every single question in our lives, or that science is completely infallible either. We base that on a whole load of assumptions and worldview, and if you want to talk to me more about that, I'd love to.
I agree with all of that. That was a really useful way of looking at it, and from a scientist as well, doing research. Think of a little story that might help to land all that even more. Imagine you're walking along a dark path later tonight, and let's say for the sake of this story, you feel safe, there aren't safeguarding issues around the story. You see somebody, it's a guy, and he's looking under a lamppost for something on the ground, and he's just searching around in the spot of light under the lamppost. And he looks like he's a bit, he looks safe, it looks okay, so you approach him and you say, have you lost something? And he says, yeah, I've lost my keys, I need my keys. And you say, I'll help you look. And so together you begin to look around in this spot of light under the lamppost. And they're clearly not there. The keys are not there under the lamppost. So you say to him, where did you lose your keys? And he says, I don't know. And then you say, well, why are you looking only under this spot of light under the lamppost? And he says, well, here is where the light is brightest. And as you step sideways, slightly out of the spot of light, your eyes become accustomed to the greys and the other hues. And you can still see outside of the spot of light. And you begin to see that there's something on the ground in front of you, and it's his keys. But he says, I'm only looking here under the light because this is where the light is brightest. That's what science does. It shines a particular light on particular subject matter, but it doesn't follow that therefore that's where the God of the universe would choose to reveal himself, and the only way he'd reveal himself. It just might be that in this little orange book on the table in front of you, the God who made all creation has gently offered you his Son, and stories and recollections and records of his Son as his offer to you. So I'd encourage you, look under the spot of light, but also don't make the mistake of thinking that that's where God's put the evidence only. He might have put it in other places, and it might be just as rational and just as logical and just as evidence-based to look outside. But look around, and maybe God might meet your question. Are you there? Will you show yourself to me?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Maybe just to mention one example of something under the light and one example of something outside of the light. So, in other words, scientific evidence that points towards God in general, not particularly the Christian God. I'd highly recommend a book called The God Hypothesis by Stephen Meyer. And in general, Stephen Meyer is great to listen to as well. He's got a lot of stuff online. And one thing that he speaks about in that book is the DNA code. And so it's very interesting that the DNA code is very similar to a computer code. So even just straight off the bat, that's very interesting. It seems like perhaps the apparent design in the human body is similar to the way that we like to design things in computer coding. But then going beyond that, you can say, okay, well, the great thing about codes is we can just run the numbers on code. So you can say you have these 4 base letters, and they have to be arranged in a certain order to code for useful proteins. And so you can say, right, okay, well, if we were to randomly choose these base letters in a certain order that was, for example, 1,000,000 bits long, that might be a typical protein string, then what's the likelihood that it codes for a useful protein? And you can just run those numbers. And then you find that the likelihood is very, very small. And then you say, okay, well, that's very, very unlikely. But what if we just run this system for a long, long, long time? Maybe we run it for billions and billions of years. Then eventually, surely we're going to get to the point where we get some useful proteins. And again, you can run the numbers on that. And I don't think billions of years is actually long enough. When you look at how long those strings are, I think actually you need much, much longer than billions of years. And then the other thing is time even your friend anyway? Because if you were to get something that was useful, that's very unlikely, and then you get further genetic mutation, is that going to help you to continue to improve, even with the mechanism of natural selection helping you along the way? Or is it going to lose what you started with in that DNA string? So I think that's quite an interesting thing to look at scientifically. And then something outside of the light that's nevertheless still very evidence-based that I was talking about on Monday is the historical evidence. So for some reason we seem to like historical evidence less than scientific evidence in our culture, but I don't quite know why, because the historical evidence for Christianity is highly compelling. And one thing I was talking about on Monday is the accounts in the Old Testament before Jesus that point forwards to him. And since the 1940s discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know, and academic scholarship is in consensus, that these Old Testament texts were certainly written before the time of Jesus. And so then you have to wrestle with the question of how were they able to predict so many details about his life, that he was going to be born in Bethlehem, that he was going to be born to a virgin, and so on and so forth, that he was going to die for his people, be rejected by his people. After he died on a tree, he was going to be pierced with a spear, etc. And, I went through this on Monday. And then, you say, well, okay, maybe Jesus purposefully lived those things out. For some of them, that's possible. For others, he's not in control of them at all. He's not in control of where he was born. And he's not in control of what happens to him after he's died. And then you say, well, maybe these things are rewritten afterwards in order to reconcile with the Old Testament texts. But then again, that falls down too, because what incentive would they have had to lie and fabricate afterwards when Jesus specifically told his followers not to lie? And the price that they had to pay for lying, particularly about the resurrection, was their own life, which they gladly gave. So there's compelling historical evidence for Christianity, as well as scientific evidence for God in general as well.
If you don't know where to start with looking at the historical evidence, have a look at the resurrection, because all the other claims of Christianity kind of stand or fall on that. And I don't actually know if it's on the bookstore or not, but there's a really good book called The Empty Tomb by, I think it's Val Grieve, which is a really small little book and goes through the evidence of the resurrection and is really good for asking, okay, given all this evidence, what is the most likely scenario? Have a read, go from there.
Yeah, thanks. So we'll go for one last question. I'm sorry we've...
Jesus Christ. Very simple. If he is who the New Testament presents him as being, if that picture of Jesus is even generally true, even just approximately true, if he really did and said all that stuff that it's pictured that he did and said, then any reasonable person in this room has to be somewhere between, I need to investigate that and find out if that is true, or my Lord and my God, thank you for saving me, thank you for revealing yourself to me, you're God. That's a challenge, isn't it? Can I say that's exactly where I found myself as an undergraduate. I was wanting to have a coherent, thoughtful, sort of engaged, evidence-based view of the world that treated human beings with the appropriate sensitivities that I thought that they needed. I didn't want to have a philosophy that detached people or hurt people. And I found myself having to come back and back again to this character who stands out in human history, head and shoulders above everybody else. Did 2,000 years ago God reveal the fullness of himself in the person of Jesus? That was the question I had to kept coming back to. That's the challenge of this week. What is the good news? The good news is Jesus. I knelt down on the floor in my student room, and I'd come to believe that God was real, but I didn't know him. And I said, God, I think you're here. I think you're in this room. I think you're aware of me. I think you're pure and you're holy. Because if you're God, you've got to be pure and holy. I think you're real. I think you're pure. I think you're holy. And if there's one thing I know about myself, it's that I'm not pure and holy. Will you help me? Will you wash me? Will you clean me up? You see me as I am, and you're holy, and I'm not. Will you forgive me? Will you rescue me? And that was the night I became a Christian, because that is the center of Christian faith, is saying, God's real. He's revealed himself in Jesus. There's a way for us to come back to that God. So I knelt down, and that was my prayer. I didn't have like a clever phrase or clever words or anything like that. I didn't know how to pray in like a Christian way. I just thought God was there and that he was holy, and I wanted to know him. And the reason why I've got in the car a couple of times this week to come across from Oxford and done a few hours driving, and the reason why a number of our team and speakers are coming here this week and are trying to serve you guys is because we think that we've found the best thing in the universe, and that's Jesus. So thank you for the question, and may God bless your journey and your search. I hope you find him.